Hi and welcome. I'm recording this now in the middle of the coronavirus um, quarantine, which is a time that, amongst other things, we have a time to be alone in different things. At the beginning, already before this time in Lent, I had already thought of doing something like this of in person while I'm here in Ecuador. This is a kind of a presentation. It was going to be a workshop as well on discovering some of the food that we can find in the deserts of life, and that in the spiritual sense, particularly related to the time of Jesus in the desert in his 40 days where there's nothing to eat, there's nothing to do, there's no place to go, there's no neighbors, he's completely in quarantine, but this is something that feeds him. So this is the kind of the aim of this presentation, and this in sort of way of using and finding in the scriptures food for the time when we're looking for spiritual food. And usually that's kind of, I call it a desert, a time when we're hungry, we don't have things at our disposal that can satisfy in a certain way. We need something else, and there's some other food. So the title of the workshop was Food in the Desert, and it was done here in Ecuador. I had begun it, and actually it was the day before I was going to share it when everything sort of shut down. So I've got this presentation in Spanish. I intended to do it also in English for you and other English speakers. So today I'm going to go through it. I adjusted it to be mostly in English, pretty much all in English. But I hope that it's something that you can find something during this time, even in the time of the quarantine, and in this time of Lent too. So the slideshow, it's sort of this presentation and a workshop. I kind of now have to kind of keep it in more in the presentation mode, but I get a few gimmicks that hopefully will be able to lighten the whole journey in a way. Food in the desert, and you can see in the desert, this is the situation, is that we don't have much, and our journey in this time, it's kind of any time in life, but it kind of comes more to the forefront in this time of Lent, is the idea. What happens when you don't have, when you're hungry for something on the inside? You're missing something in life, and there's something that you have on the inside. There's a hunger for something more on the inside. So this is the idea. As Jesus goes into the desert, he spends time. There's something really important for him to eat when he's there. Now it doesn't look like it. It looks completely barren, and that's the whole point, is on the outside it doesn't look like there's much, but there's sort of hidden treasures, you might say, in here where you have food that you can find. And it's this food that is going to be the nourishment for our souls. So to do that, I want to go back to the origins of the four Gospels. So, I just a little background. When you want to know someone, let's say you meet someone, if you're from the city, you might meet someone on an app, or you might meet someone romantically, and I'm talking, you might meet someone out at the gym, or you might meet someone out at the supermarket, or you might meet a friend of a friend. And there's different ways to meet a person, and you just want to gradually get to know the person. And so you begin to know, one of the first things you talk about is, who are you? What is your past? I don't mean necessarily romantically, but like, what do you do? Like, what is it that you do every day? What do you do for work? Where are you from? You want to know these other things about the person. And finally, if it gets to that level, then you go and you meet the parents. And if you meet parents, you're really meeting, you're encountering where the person is from, their origins. And you can really start to know the person in a deeper way, in a better way. And you really need to know the person in order to form relationship. So, and to understand, and to know the person, to know who they really are. So I use all of that as the word context. You need to know context of a person to really get to know the person. And in the same way, we're going to, this is kind of giving away the prize at the end, but the Gospels are things that we're going to discover. There's food in these, and so we want to know a little bit of the context. Where do the Gospels come from? because then we can know them, and then we can relate to them, and then now they become something that we can go deeper in a little bit. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the origins of the four Gospels in that dynamic of how they're formed. In the next several slides or so, we're going to focus on that. Now, this is a map that's in Spanish, but I think you get the point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what happens at the very end. What happens at the very end of the whole experience with Jesus? In other words, you've got so many people that have encountered Jesus in different ways and for different lengths of time. And then comes Good Friday, he dies, he's buried, and then he rises Easter Sunday. Now, as soon as Jesus dies, you now have a total number of people who have encountered him in some way or other. Now, that number of people who've encountered him living, alive, now that's over. So that number it's maxed out. It can only go down from there. So you get this whole quantity of people who have met Jesus, and we call them witnesses. They've witnessed something. They've experienced something, and they've experienced with their own personhood who this person is. So you get this quantity of witnesses, and now these witnesses they have this whole ton of experience. Well, what are we going to do with this? And they're confused and afraid, and there's a lot going on. And then you have Pentecost, and then now they have a spirit. They have this spirit, and now they're going to do something with those experiences that they have. So when they start out, and I'm drawing approximate lines here. I just did a quick sketch to capture the dynamic. This isn't meant to be exact and detail-oriented. This is a map from one of the early centuries of the church, and some scholars or some scholars' estimation of these early Christian communities and where they are. So what I'm trying to do is capture an effect here. So I'm drawing these lines to show this is where these witnesses started to go out after receiving this sort of spirit. It sort of broke the ice on what to do with this experience. So they extend to different sides. They start to go to the north, especially through the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire had developed roadways. It was easy to travel, and that was very much one of the easiest pathways. But before getting into the writings that just came up, what I want to point out is notice that there's different colors of the green, and that's meant to just approximate. I kind of filled it in with different colors of green to express that each of these witnesses has a different tint on things. They have their own experience from their own personal biases, and they have their own experience based on how long and what type of experience they had, because there are a whole variety of experiences. So these witnesses go out and they extend through much of this Eurasian world, or Euro-African as well. And what happens is when they get there, they begin to share their experiences, what they've witnessed, and that begins to generate this activity in others and begin to form communion and community. And they begin to kind of catch that same spirit. And this is sort of the coming of the Holy Spirit in kind of formal language, but in the practical sense, there's a generating this is a sort of divine element that moves inside of people to embrace this. There's a timing to things, and there's a way that things are presented. Communities begin to form, and within those communities as well, you can have writings. Now, not everyone could write back then. It was sort of like today. You might have a print shop. Today, you might go to a print shop. You might need something printed, but you can't just print something out. You need some sort of expertise to get your document printed in a certain way. Now, some of that's come more into the home. People can have printers in their homes, and plenty do. But that's the type of thing, is that there's always in some ways the next step in technology that you can't do. So this is a time where to actually write things down, well, that was the next step in technology, and you needed sort of experts. So there are some places that began to write these things down. And as they began to write them down, these writings begin to grow. You might add another piece or another. And what happens as well is that as people pass between the churches, they begin to exchange and bring some of these writings over to another church. So some of the churches begin to piece a few together. And some of the communities are kind of left more with their own. So we can imagine all this. It kind of makes sense that now you have this bit of mixing over time and a few more writings, and the writings grow a little bit more over time. And as you're continuing to develop the communities and the writings are growing, there's something that's happening. And now I put here, now is the time to compile the writings. One of the things that, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have a fixed number of witnesses, people who actually have the real experience with Jesus. And over time, that's going to go down because they're going to die. They're going to die. So you now have a dwindling number of, the number of witnesses going down, but the number of and size of the communities is going up. And the number and quantity of writings is going up. So now you get to this sort of tipping point where you start to realize, hey, it might be a good idea before all these witnesses have died off, because you can't get new original witnesses, to start to compile these writings with them so that we do this before they're all gone. So witnesses can be with us, and the witnesses can be the ones sort of guiding that collection of compiling of all these writings and compiling of the communication unity of the churches before they're all gone. Because once they're all gone, who's to say how you need to piece this whole picture together? And this became this sort of tipping point. So around the time of the, let's say around 70 AD, 60 to 70 AD, up to maybe even up to the past the turn of the first century, up to maybe 120 or so, 110 might be the time that John is written, a little bit later. So you've got this window of time, and this is the dynamic, is that the witnesses are dying out. The church has grown and the writings have grown, but they need to be compiled. It's gotten to that stage. So, and the urgency is you need to have them involved. You need to have the witnesses involved in them guiding it, and to have their fingerprint on how to sew and knit these things together that have sprung up on all sides. So eventually you begin to have this compiling action that happens, and there's a whole variety, but I've indicated here on the map here there are 4, and just because we're going to end up with 4 Gospels, but there were others. And then there's a sort of next discerning process of, well, which one of these is actually capturing the important the essence of the message, and which are kind of straying off and not quite there. There's something off in that. So you need this judgment that's going to happen as well. But as you can see on the map, there's still some of the witnesses left, but eventually the witnesses, it comes to a point where all the witnesses are dead. And what are you left with is, you're left with now this time where the churches are now there, the community of people who are second generation witnesses. They're witnesses to the witnesses, original witnesses, you might say, and the writings. So you've got those two things. You got the churches and how they live and what they've come up with on how to live, and you might call it the traditions. And on this side, you have the writings that are grouped together. And this is the process that's important. And I'm going to review it very briefly and put a little bit of a analogy to it. So we had the first stage of original witnesses going out, sharing the experience that they had, and then you have this tipping point, and then there's a time to gather things together. And I'm going to use the analogy of sowing. Now, to go out with seeds and to be kind of spreading the seed around, and the seed sort of takes root, the seed begins to grow, But the original seed eventually is going to die. I mean, that's the whole kind of idea, that the seed is going to it's going to be cracked open, and now the plant comes up, but there's going to be fruit, and then the fruit is the harvesting of the fruit. So these are general pictures. I don't know these people. I should probably credit the pictures. I took them right off the internet, but they are from, according to the Internet, Ecuador. On the left is actually corn that they're sowing, and on the right is cacao or cocoa. Those are the pods from the cocoa plant, and those are inside is where you would get cacao or cocoa. Inside is where you would get the cocoa bean, and then that would be processed into eventually chocolate or cocoa powders you might use. So, but this is the analogy. The analogy is that there's a time that's gone out in sowing, and there's a time for a harvest. And this is where you can see the spirit of things. The spirit of things is that these witnesses have been given this incredible treasure and experience, and now they're going to go out, and they're going to share that experience. But then there comes a time too of harvesting from that experience and gathering things in. Now, it's important to know that, because this is the dynamic in which the Gospels are written. And when we get to looking at now these 4 Gospels, the way that they're written, and to see them as a harvest, and to see them as a coming together of fruits where there's food. So there's food inside of these. And there are 4 Gospels. There are names given to each one. Who the actual author is, for me, it's not that all that important. For the idea behind it is that it's witnesses, it's original witnesses in collaboration with others, or maybe on their own, and they've done this compiling. They've done this because it's a first harvest of the church. And it's typical to put a name on a document. I'm fine with all of that. I don't need to know was it exactly this person or not, but to know what we're going to see here in the basic dimension of it, the basic value that it's going to give us as food, is that process that we just talked about. Okay, so each one has a collection. Now you can see some of the shapes and colors are similar across these 3. There's a reason for that, is that they are drawing on similar sources. They've gathered from similar areas. There's some original other source that's out there. People has been long theorized. It's called the Q. It's this other document of a gathering of writings that people believe that Matthew and Luke gathered off of, in addition to Mark. Mark was, according to current scholarship, is the first that was gathered together. A lot of Mark is reflected in both Matthew and Luke, but in all of these, the general idea is that the person writing it has gathered together, and then these authors have knit it together in a particular way. They've made certain adaptations at certain times, because they're original witnesses, and they're doing this additionally for specific audiences. So they're gathering, in a sense, these things to be able to convey this testimony to particular audiences as well as the broader audience. I don't think that anyone is just limiting to one particular audience, because I think it's probably in the back of their mind that, hey, this will apply more broadly as well if it's understood in context. But the idea, though, is that that each of the folks writing has their particular way of gathering things together. So it's an integration, use another word, a synthesis, that they have done, that is done in a unique way in each one. So this gathering together is going to be a key for finding the food. This is what we're going to get to. Now, if you notice, each one of these authors also has, it's co-authored. There are 2 authors. The author is the actual person or human people or person, and it's the Holy Spirit. So it's both divine and human, this authorship. So it's co-authored. And the idea is going to be that, hey, when we listen to the human author, the amazing thing is that's what the divine author is saying as well. And these are the two key things, is that, that each one is going to have their own way, and this way of gathering things together, and their own message, and this process of gathering. And the second is that when we listen to this human author or human authors, that's what they're trying to say is what the divine author is trying to say. And these are the two sort of main points of this whole way of kind of looking at the Gospels, of finding the food in them. So these 4 Gospels are different lengths. They have different general audiences. The 3, Matthew, Mark, Luke, draw more on similar resources. John kind of draws on different resources in a way, because in fact it may be that John had all of the resources before, and John is sort of adding on to things and in other words, not including the specifics of the other Gospels, but now that those ones are known, he's kind of adding in. There's a lot of different theories about that, possible. But what's important is each one has a certain message. And each one's message then is unique. Each one, in a certain sense, and they're integrated, they're connected, but each one has a message that they want to emphasize. They're bringing to the surface something, they're bringing into relief, might be a better way of saying it, a certain dimension of their experience that they have in their experience with Jesus, or guided by the witnesses who were with them, that when they knit these writings together, that it fulfills all of those other writings, and they can see this message inside of it they want to convey. Now, this is just worth a little bit of time of what is the real story, because each one of these gospel accounts has a story of the life of Jesus. This is the testimony has been, here's this person who has died and risen, and this is my experience with them. And so you get this piecing together of the life, and each one is different. And in fact, some of them are contradictory. Now, contradictory, to me, when we understand this process of the gathering together in this very human way, I don't have a problem with that once I understand this process. It's because we often think, well, because we may do things differently, and when someone publishes a scientific book, for example, there has to be a thorough sort of review process, for example, where peer review. These are great things when we're looking for scientific fact. But that's not the intent of these books, and that's not the intent of these writings. The intent is to do this harvesting in the same way that you would harvest food or fruit. You're not looking to prove anything. When you go out and, and each person's going out into a field and harvesting things, you're not saying, okay, does my harvest compare with yours, right? It's not that. It's that you're harvesting a food, and you're harvesting a fruit, something that gives you nourishment. So there's a different goal in the sense of having this sort of what we might call today historical precision, as opposed to, because there's a reason for that, as opposed to here where people are gathering because, hey, they want this food and this experience to be passed on to others. So what is the real story? We don't know. And this is the important thing. The real story of what really happened is a mystery. It's a mystery. And this is part of, from the perspective of faith, if you see, according to the scripture and the scriptural faith in that sense, God always sends a messenger. If you don't listen to the messenger, you're not going to know God. And see, God always does that because God wants to reveal a sense of humility. Will you listen to this little guy? If you don't listen to this little guy, you can't know the big guy. This is the whole point. It's like God He's not just announcing things out of the sky to all of us all the time. He's not that way, and not like a parent, in a sense, where a parent might say, do this, do that from above. God sends us a little person, a messenger. And it's the messenger that you have to listen to if you want to, kind of the gatekeeper in a sense. If you want to, you got to listen to the messenger if you want to know who the source, the one who wrote the message, the one who sends the message. So this is why Jesus comes at the bottom of society, not at the top. And these messengers, these throng of witnesses are messengers. And it's important to listen to each one. Because we won't, and that's the key to knowing the real story. What really happened? Well, we first have to listen to, what does Matthew have to say? What does Mark have to say? What does Luke have to say? So we want to, and John, so what do we want to spend time in that particular gospel, listening to that author. What does this author have to say? And that means walking through and seeing how they write, in a sense, what is the message inside of theirs? And each one at a time, which means that, because by doing that, when we kind of respect the messenger, we're going to listen to what this messenger has to say, each one of these messengers, then what happens is, you begin to get some insight into the real story. And that's the only way to know the real story is, one, it's a mystery, which means you can't figure it out. Your research can only support or disprove whatever insights you get by, B, listening to each messenger. Let them speak what they want to say and listen to it. And when you do that, you can gradually see bit by bit what that real story is. What is our temptation? Our temptation is to say, hey, Matthew says this, Mark says that. Well, what's going on here? What's the real story? This seems either fake, or what am I supposed to do with that? And we lose patience. We don't see, because, why? Because, understandable, because we don't know this background that I've just kind of covered. We don't see it from that perspective. And this is why, again, I go back, it's so important to know the context. The context in how it's written, the context in why it's done, the story, the background story. It's important. Unfortunately, it's not talked about or taught anywhere, which is the worst thing, because it means that, and this is why we have such a problem in Christianity, and the churches everywhere are empty and all this stuff, is because people run everywhere with these Gospels and Bibles and sacraments, and they don't know the story. And you use it, you abuse it, is what happens. So when we look at what each author is going to say, we get to see a little bit. Now what we want to do is, the other problem is that the traditions of the church often are trying to, they mishmash things together. Why? I don't say it's a bad thing. It depends on the context. If you're going to do a Christmas story and you want to gather your family and community together, and you do a creche or you do a drama, in Latin America, the more entering into things is more, and it's a good thing. But you've got shepherds and you've got wise men at the creche scenes. Well, in no gospel do you have both, right? So we carry these ideas which have served their purpose for the time in the way that you want to enter into this mystery, but we then carry those back into looking at the Gospels. So we're going to think in Matthew like, hey, well, here are the wise men coming, and then we might assume the shepherds are there as well, but you can't do that. And this is going to be the big leap, probably the biggest struggle that folks have, which is to keep the mishmash out of things and just take what each gospel writer is saying. John at the foot of the cross, you've seen tons of artwork. Who's at the foot of the cross? Mary and John. But in reality, we don't really know. You don't want to make prejudgments about that going into it, because in Luke, Mark, Matthew, there's no mention of them. So when you read those Gospels, you can't in your mind put those people there. That's not what they're trying to say. If they wanted to have them there, they'd put them there. You don't want to assume that that's happening. So, because there's a message that each Gospel writer is trying to convey, and that's what we want to do. Listen to the messenger. Is John is the beloved disciple and the mother of Jesus at the foot of the cross in reality? Or you can find out. And the only way to find out is to read each gospel separately. And then that's how it's, because there's a great, part in Luke and Matthew, Jesus says, you've hidden these things from the wise and the learned, and you reveal them to the little ones. It so applies here. That if you want to know the real story, you have to trust in the messenger that God is sending in these. And not try to be, hey, logically I put this together, what's the deal? Because what we're not missing in that is we're missing out on the context around things. And hopefully this discussion has helped with that. Been a little long-winded, I apologize for that. Let's move on. I hope it's useful. This is the point, that each evangelist has his own message. And we need to listen to each evangelist separately. This is key to understanding and finding the food in the Gospels. So, how they're made and put together, the fact that the divine author, what the divine message is discovered through the human message in the authors, and that we've got to listen to each one separately. These are the 3 points so far. So, what we're going to do is we're going to separate one. And now we're going to start in a sense of, we're going to do an example. Matthew is a place where there's a great sort of example that's in Matthew. So I'm going to focus on the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to put the others aside for now and say that Matthew provides clues. So this is the idea that now that we know that things are knitted together and that the author is sewing together, in a sense, these writings that they've gathered and added, in some cases, their own writings, their own experiences in. It's all been kind of integrated and knit together. You begin to see that when doing that, the nature of that process, the nature of the process is that you begin to see that there are clues to it that are placed along the way. In other words, there's a person may include like certain words in one place and also in another place that other writers don't use. And what they're doing is seeing where the stitching is, the stitching in the knitting together of the Gospels. You're seeing these points, these highlight points that the writer is making connections with to make their point. So, and I call them stitching connections. And these are clues. The clues as to how the writer assembled and ordered their gospel. So, for example, you might find something in a passage in one location, and you find something, hey, this is the same type of thing. Wow, he's using the same expression or the same words or the same character shows up over here. And so you're seeing some of the stitching that the author is using. And now you can say, I'm going to connect these two together with a stitch, in a sense, So, and then you discover, bing, there's an insight. And what we're doing when we do this is we're using our little process of inductive reasoning to discover how the writer put together the gospel in a certain way. In other words, we're respecting the way that the passage, the gospel was written. And to read something, you have to respect the way it was written if you want to understand it. And this is the key, is that now we're going to make these stitching connections. And ding, ding, there's a light that goes on, and then you may find fruit. Now there's the cacao. Makes a lot more sense down here in rural Ecuador. But this is, this is inside a fruit. Inside the cacao is you've got these white juice pulp surrounding the cocoa beans or the seeds. That's what they are, and it's great. It's awesome. That's why animals will go and chow on it. The squirrels, I guess, big attackers they destroy the cacao crops. So, but the idea is when we make that connection, we've discovered something. A light goes on, and there's food. All right. So when you discover these connections in the gospel, we're actually tapping into the very way, the very spirit in which it was made, and we're seeing an insight into the message that the author wants to convey. The human author, and by that, the divine author. We're seeing what God wants to really say. And it's a food that can come inside of us, and wow, it feeds us, lifts us up, and touches us. So this process is repeated. You might find another place where there's another, there's a phrase here. There's something that happens here. That's weird. Why is he talking about the time of day here? Oh, you know what? He talked about the same time of day way over there, So now you start to see connections between these passages, and because you're seeing how the gospel was knit together, how it was stitched up. So, and then there's the voice. So now you hear the message. You hear the voice of the author. And then the divine author comes out.